Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar this morning. We are just waiting for our attendees to arrive. As always, we've got quite a few people coming through, which is no surprise given the topics of the day, two pretty key ones, umbrella reforms and global expansion. So we'll kick off shortly. In the meantime, just as a reminder to everyone, if you can try and put your questions into the Q&A box, that would be super useful. I'll keep encouraging you to do so as we go through the session, and then put those questions across to Sean at the end. Any that we miss, if they're in the Q&A piece, then we can obviously follow up and come back to you when we send out the recording at the end of the session. So we've still got a few people coming through. Don't be a stranger as well. If you want to put up a note in on chat to say hello, please do. I think we've got quite a few of you now that come in frequently on the webinars, so we're building up our own little community here. So feel free to say hello in the chat piece and put your questions in the Q&A when you're ready. So I think the numbers are starting to top out now, so I think we're good to go. So morning, everybody. Thanks for giving us a little bit of your Thursday to join us today. Today's webinar is called Navigating Change, Umbrella Reforms, Employment Rights and Global Expansion. So I think in this session, what we're doing here is putting together three of probably the hottest key topics that's being discussed around the staffing industry at the moment. So hopefully we can give you some fresh insight how you should be thinking about these topics and challenges, but also how you might actually be able to create some opportunities for your business if you approach them in the right way. Now, I think it's fair to say, and we'd all recognise that through a combination of a prolonged flat market and the future prospect of these legislation changes, it's fairly challenging out there at the moment in the market, and therefore for staffing business leaders to sort of think about the long-term strategies and how you can be match fit to maximise the opportunities when they arise. So the topics that we want to sort of pick through today, we'll start with the umbrella reforms. And we'll talk specifically about some of the misinformation or divided opinion that we're seeing around the legislation. We'll have a little bit of a look at MSPs in particular that have got a pretty acute challenge here around the way that the reforms have shaped up, and talk through a little bit about the solutions that are available in the market and what Sean's views are on those. We'll then move on to the Employment Rights Bill. So all good fun stuff today. Yeah, what's coming down the pipe, and specifically when does this kick in? How HMRC are approaching it, how they're phasing the approach, but also what are the opportunities that could potentially come from that. And I am a big believer that, given that we're all often in working in outsourced businesses, our role is to remove risk for our customers. So yes, risks may be increasing, but that makes it even more relevant to be speaking to businesses like ourselves and your organisation. So there will be opportunity there. We'll then move on to our last topic, which is global expansion. And I'm super excited to hear Sean's views on this, because he's done a lot of work in this area with businesses and those that work with him and his consultancy. So we'll look at global expansion as a strategy, challenge, the thought process initially of why you might be looking at doing this, and making sure there's a strong business case to do so. And then look at some of the do's and don'ts and takeaways that you guys can gain from this morning if you are looking at expanding globally. And then finally, we'll finish off with Q&A. So as I said, please do put the questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try and leave 10-15 minutes to pick through those at the end of the session. So today's webinar is brought to you by Giant Group, who are, if you don't know, a leading contingent workforce management business operating now for getting on for 35 years. And we manage worker populations for a range of customers, recruitment businesses, MSPs and hirers in the UK, but also globally. And I'm delighted today to be joined by our keynote speaker, Sean Moran, founder of the Orara Group. Sean is an advisor, non-exec director and global compliance strategist, and he's been working with businesses for over a decade now to increase compliance and help them find best ways to nurture talent. He's got particular experience of the life sciences sector, which has obviously been really fast paced over the previous years, and he's built a reputation for crafting bespoke, aligned strategies that are as compliant and ethical as they are commercially effective. I'm sure Sean is a face that people are familiar with. He spends a lot of time working through APSCO, advising on the public policy board there, and he's a regular speaker at a number of high profile events. So we're really looking forward to hear from Sean today. He's a keen advocate for looking at innovation, championing the use of AI to help in businesses, and doing so in a respectful way, making sure that AI and automation as a concept is enhancing the people part of recruitment businesses, not necessarily replacing it. So super keen to hear from you today, Sean. Welcome.
G'day, how you going?
Yeah, really good, thanks, really good. So I'll put forward a couple of set questions to Sean as we weave through those topics. And then, as I say, at the end, we'll have some questions, time for questions, so please do put them in the Q&A. So I think let's get cracking, Sean. So first of all, we're going to look at umbrella reforms and some of the ongoing uncertainty, shall we say, that's in the market. So there's obviously been a bit of noise and some conflicting messages around this. From your perspective, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions that agencies and workers need to be aware of?
I think the first and most striking is the joint and several liability. I think that people don't really comprehend what the effect is of that. There was a really great article that I reshared on LinkedIn by Rebecca Seeley Harris, that's her name.
Yeah.
And what she was talking about, then I sort of backed up, was the fact that joint and several liability really sits inside of a group structure. I'm going to get a little bit technical here for everybody, so just bear with me on this. So joint and several liability means if you're in a group, one of your businesses, normally the lower of the businesses, is in breach of something or other, and then HMRC can then chase the group for payment for the non-compliance from that one company or that one entity. In the context of what we're talking about with the umbrella reforms, it's almost putting a group structure around the chain that sits there. So you have the worker, the umbrella company, the agency, maybe an MSP thrown in there just for good measure for complexity, and then the end client. So now you're starting to think, okay, well, what does that mean to me? Well, if the worker is just the worker, they're outside of it all, because they've got to be the one, yes, we're paying their national insurance contributions and the employer's national insurance contributions, and also deducting the necessary income tax. But it's the actual act of the umbrella company that should be doing that. So if that umbrella company is a less scrupulous one, probably you could say, and they just don't do it, or they misclassify, or any of those kind of variations, and they fold, HMRC won't just go, the debt's done. They'll then come up to the recruitment business, and the recruitment business will then become liable. But what's interesting in the way that this has been proposed is that there is no true defense. It's a statutory obligation. So even if you've put all the mitigation in place, then you're still on the hook for it. You will only be on the hook for paying what is owed. At the moment, there's no prescription that I'm aware of. That could change over the course of the necessary consultations that are going through Parliament at the moment. But you're going to be on the hook for the national insurance, both ER and EE, and then equally the income tax deductions. So that's the biggest misconception that we're seeing at the moment, that actually the relationship inside of the chain and how that's actually then going to be interpreted, not only by HMRC from a taxation perspective, but equally the Fair Work Agency as well.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point there as well, that it actually goes up a level, right? So it's not just looking at joint and several liability for whether or not someone has calculated and then paid tax correctly. It's actually joint and several liability on business failure of an umbrella company potentially, right? So you could have a scenario where the umbrella company's operated compliantly, it's done its tax calculations, but it's gone bankrupt, it's failed, and the tax has not been remitted to HMRC. So I think it's super important for businesses to consider that this is as much about financial stability in the umbrella market as it is around compliance, because if you think through how the market might consolidate, which I'm sure it will post April of next year, it's going to be tough times for certain umbrellas that are, missed the cut on PSLs. So key that businesses keep a focus on that, Sean.
Yeah, and what you're trying to demonstrate as a business, whether that be the end client, the agency, or the MSP in between, is that you've got a strategy in place that actually tries to do the best it possibly can. It won't mitigate you from the risk of an umbrella company going bust, but it'll certainly show you the indicators to go, you know what, we may not want to work with that company prior to it going bust. So you can actually then move your workers onto a more stable, financially stable, and also compliantly stable umbrella provider.
Yeah, fair shout. Because when you're looking at financial stability, it's always generally information on company's house, which is obviously 18 months old. But there are certainly indicators you can glean from that data that will point to the direction of travel that a company may be struggling. So I think that's fair. Moving on slightly, then, obviously agency PAYE as a delivery model has kind of got pulled into the debate here, with some sort of mentioning that if workers are being supplied via agencies, they too could be the purported umbrella and caught by this legislation. So I'd be interested on getting your views on that, whether you think that's founded or not.
Yeah, it is founded to a lesser extent, because ultimately you're acting as a pseudo employer, pseudo umbrella company in that sense. And what the legislation that's changed is actually the umbrella company has been brought underneath the employment agencies and employment business conduct regulations of 2003, or for the rest of this webinar, the conduct regs. And that is the auspice that's been put under. So as a recruitment business, you're already operating under that. So there's no change for you. It's just making the umbrella company sit inside that and become compliant to that as well. So it's just creating a level of playing field. Whereas prior to this, an agency PAYE would have been caught and it would have had its own rules that it needs to comply to. Umbrella companies now just being brought under that fold. So there is no change from an agency PAYE scheme. The only thing is, there's going to be a potential shortage of skilled professionals in the payrolling side of things that the agency market can then attract to bring in. So you've got to start thinking about, if you're a small to medium-sized agency, okay, do we really want to go down this path, or is this a part that we should outsource to a strong PSL? That will give you, yes, a little bit of risk, but it won't give you the constraints of having to find somebody and then manage it all on your own. Because payrolling, as you could probably attest, Dan, is quite pardon the expression, a taxing environment to work in.
Yeah, it can be tricky. I mean, I think, again, it's difficult when we're talking generally about the recruitment market. It's nuanced as different sectors, and for different sectors, agency PAYE may be more appropriate than engaging with umbrellas. But I think you're right, at a high level, it can be expensive because you've got people to deliver the payroll alongside purchasing of a software solution to do so. And the common theme we hear is agencies just want to focus on search and selection in the main. So I've not heard that many recruiters that are looking at knee-jerking on these reforms to say we're not going to use umbrellas moving forward, we're just going to go PAYE. They're already under pressure from a profit perspective. So if if they can avoid increased costs by using trusted partners, generally speaking, that seems to be the position.
And I'm skipping forward a little bit here, but
yeah.
You've also got to consider now, if you're going to be payrolling under an agency PAYE scheme, there's going to be a massive administrative burden. I'm not talking about the payrolling side of it here. We're talking about the management side of things here, in terms of actually understanding and complying with the, what's going to become the ERA, or Employment Rights Act, because there's no longer a bill. That is going to put obligations on the employer, which an agency PAYE will be, and you're going to have day one worker rights, you're going to have pension contributions, which you already have to manage anyway, you're going to have paternity and maternity changes as well. So there's a lot of different burdens that we put onto an agency PAYE scheme that they've got to be aware of. Yes, it may work for some, and fantastic, and hats off to them, because that's a strategic business decision where they're capable and competent to do that. But again, for the smaller to medium-sized recruiter, I would potentially urge them to go and work with a strong, competent and compliant PSL of umbrella providers.
Yeah, good. And it's good. Yeah, I think it's super relevant. You make the link, because you're quite right. It's not lost on a lot of the recruitment leaders that you've got these nasties that we'll come on to in a second coming down the pipe from an Employment Rights Act perspective that increases costs. And so actually there's a drive there to actually to get those workers off your books. So you kind of just got to weigh up your strategy as business and how does that align. Just staying on the umbrella reforms for a bit longer, there's been a phrase pushed out on LinkedIn that's been interesting and gained some various comments. This phraseology around collective liability. What's your view on this? Do you think that's a thing? How does that, what does collective liability mean in the sense that it's being promoted on LinkedIn?
So generally speaking, collective liability is a collective in the sense of it is an industry or it is a sector or it is a larger group of organizations that fall under, pardon the expression here, an umbrella of definition. Joint and several liabilities is different, as I've said before. It really sits around a more of a group structure where for this, all intents and purposes, the group is the chain that sits in between you or the worker and the end client. And that's all collective and several liability. Joint and several liability actually means. Collective is being thrown around. I disagree with that interpretation. There are probably potentially, and there will be potentially far more insightful and eloquently astute people that will be able to contradict that. But from my appreciation and understanding of it, joint and several liability is vastly different to collective liability.
Yeah, I think so. My view on it is I think that the terminology is coming because some of the commentators are saying that where an agency is using an umbrella company that's obviously engaging with other agencies, there's a potential for this joint and several liability to start hopping across different agency populations. I don't think that is the case because I think the draft legislation has talked about HMRC looking at this on a payment by payment basis.
And that's where it's going to get murky. Because you start thinking about certain sectors inside the recruitment industry. So if you look at PAs, EAs, and the secretarial side of things, or receptionists or people like that you may see a receptionist one day sat at your company desk, and then 3 days later they're sat for the next week at some other company's desk, and then maybe come back to yours for a day, and then so on and so forth. This is where it's going to get really murky because you're going to have to start thinking, well, as a worker, I'm going to be with umbrella company A. They will take the hit and I will be on my proper tax code. Now, if as a recruitment business, we say that company's not on our PSL, the worker's then going to have to make the decision. Do I take this assignment and then risk that assignment being on basic rate tax compared to my normal tax code? Because you've got to make the priority, which is going to be the main source of income.
Yeah.
And the HMRC will treat anything subsequent to that as a secondary, so then it'll sit on a BR code. Yeah. So this is something that I think the workers really need to understand, and we need to, as an industry, need to educate them. And then we start thinking about, you mentioned earlier on, a consolidation inside of the umbrella industry. That is going to happen for this very reason. Above any other, that will happen because of this, because you'll start seeing the same type of company appearing on PSLs. And as a worker, I've got a couple of motivations. Obviously, the monetary side from a tax perspective, but equally the employment. So the continuation of employment. So if I'm going to go for a mortgage or something along those lines, I want to show that, yeah, actually, I've been employed by Giant, for argument's sake, for the last 5 years. Inside of that, I've had 30 different assignments, but I'm still employed. My payslip says I'm paid by Giant.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think that collective liability phraseology is leading some to say there's actually ignore where we got to on the consultation with the umbrellas employee reference number being able to be used. If you want to be super cautious, Mr. or Mrs. Agency, actually remit the tax to HMRC using the umbrella's PAYE ref, and then pay the net to the umbrella company. Then the umbrella company can process the tax down to the worker. That's a super messy model. Operationally, it's fraught with some challenges. And actually what it does is it spins the liability right round, where if, as an umbrella company, I'm then reliant on a recruitment agency paying those liabilities. Otherwise, I've then got to bridge that gap with HMRC, which might sound good from an agency perspective, but obviously not from an umbrella. So I think there was so much good work done in lobbying HMRC to get them to the point of agreeing to retain the umbrella's employee reference number and do joint and several liability, that that's a positive outcome, because it's a business as usual outcome for a lot of supply chains. So that should not be sort of thrown away easily. Anyway, let's move on then just to the topic of MSPs and frameworks. Obviously, MSPs often dictate how supply chains are structured, and obviously they've got some potential acute risk here in the way that the legislation is shaped up. So how do you think umbrella reforms may impact these standard MSP contract arrangements we see?
I'm glad I've moved out of the MSP world, is the quick answer to that, because they're really in a pickle here. Because if you start thinking about the liabilities potentially they're exposed to, you have the end client who's going to put pressure from a margin perspective. We know that's the case anyway. So then you have a supply chain that sits underneath the MSP. Now that could be multiple different agencies. So for argument's sake, say they've got 50 agencies, different agencies that supply into them. That's 50 individual liabilities to those agencies to ensure that the agency worker PAYE or the PAYE is deducted at source, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if the agencies may have 10 umbrella companies on their PSLs, and there may be a variance of 30% across that, which is a pretty conservative estimate, then you start thinking, well, hang on a minute, you go back up the chain, 50 agencies, 30% are going to have different umbrella providers. So you're now talking rough maths here, maybe over 100 different umbrella companies or something along those lines. That's a huge liability and trust that needs to be put down. So the compliance element the MSPs will throw onto the agencies will be steep.
Yeah.
And to make sure that they're mitigating any risk and they can prove, if ever challenged, that actually, yes, we did everything we could. So then that will mitigate any potential fines or penalties that could be at play. There's another model, which would be margin only, which they would step outside of the recruitment chain. So it'd be directly with that. Again, that's fraught with danger, because then are they acting as an employment business or an employment agency? Because at what point are they going to make where are they going to make their money? Is it going to be in terms of, okay, each time we get a contractor on board, you're going to pay us £1,000 or €1,000, well, £1,000 for the UK. And that means that they're going to work as an agency, or are they going to work as a business where they start taking incremental based on timesheet spend?
Yeah.
So there's a huge issue there. And the software that they're going to potentially rely on to make sure that all of the PAYE deductions are made at source and to monitor that, that's really under pressure to perform, because at the moment there's not a really strong there's a couple of suppliers that are doing okay in terms of payslip checking, but after that there's a big gap in terms of the supply of software that will allow MSPs to work in a coherent way.
Yeah, correct. Like the pay and bill system starts to become complex there when you're looking at agency margin only, although we do support some of the larger MSPs with that model, not related to this, but actually it looks like it could be a potential solution to at least to help to give visibility to what's going on in that supply chain. And just one last one before we move on to employment rights, Bill. Then obviously you just touched on wage slip checking as part of a solution, but just from a sort of due diligence perspective, if you're advising one of your agency clients, what do they think? What do you think's the best approach for them moving forward into April of next year, and when they're looking at picking umbrellas to work with?
Yeah, I mean, it is about the questioning of the umbrella to get them to provide you with examples and then counter check those with the payslip checking service.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you can make sure that, I think it's SafeRec are fairly reputable out there. There's another one that escapes me right at this moment in time, but again, they're very, very good. But after that, it's a pretty barren existence. And you've got to really do your due diligence here. So audit regularly, not do it 6 monthly. I mean, we're talking potentially extreme. If you've got a small headcount, you could probably get away doing it monthly for the first 3 months of a new starter, and then break it down to a 6 monthly cycle. Or you could do it as a quarterly cycle across your whole book of business with your umbrella provider. It is really, really important that you go into and interrogate your umbrella providers as much as physically possible.
Yeah.
There is no defense in a statutory fault. However, you can show that you did the best possible within reason to make sure that you were complying with the liabilities that you're exposed to.
Yeah, I don't
And
think
that would
anyone.
reduce fines.
Yeah, yes.
It has the
And
potential to.
although there's no statutory defence, I don't think anyone's advocating throwing your compliance and your checks out the window. Like you
No,
say, take advantage of the technology. SafeRec Veripay is the other one. They're good. It's
that's
good.
the
It's
one.
free to use for the agencies, so they may as well. I know from our perspective, we're releasing a portal that will allow a recruitment business to drill into the income that what we've done with the income that we've received, how it's broken down, right down to a worker level, and also then into pay slips, and that's real time and available for people to drop in. So we're going down the road of full transparency. Here's all the information. Check what you want when you want. Yeah, we'll plug into wage slip checking tech as well. But I think also when you're doing due diligence on umbrellas, just as a reminder to everyone, like we said before, it's as important to keep your eye on that financial stability point with the way that the market will shape up next year.
100%.
All right, let's move on then to Employment Rights Bill, or Act, as you quite rightly point out, as it moves through the stages. There's obviously been recent political stories on the Employment Rights Bill, and it's hitting the front page news. Just as a reminder to the audience, then, what do you see as the most significant changes here, and when should agencies, employers expect them to take effect? And just before you answer that, just a reminder for the audience to pop the questions into the Q&A as we go, so that we can put those to Sean at the end. So what's your view on how this is shaping up?
It's going to be interesting. It's more around the secondary legislation. That's going to be the key factor. The framework hasn't significantly changed from it coming back down from the Lords after the third reading. I think that the House of Commons were quite blunt. They pushed back on, if I say 75% of the amendments that the Lords made, will be there or thereabouts. And the rest of them were fair amendments that were brought back down, I believe. I don't think it's been diluted as much as what people would have hoped. With the backers or the chief stakeholders exiting the front bench, again, the former Deputy Prime Minister did a fantastic job in actually championing this. Did she go too far? Potentially. I think it's been rowed back a little bit, but the key bit will be the next sort of consultation period, which runs from now all the way through, off the top of my head, I think it's till summer next year, maybe autumn of next year when the House resits. There's a significant amount of consultations going on across that period, from AI in the workplace to to how they should interpret maternity and paternity rights, etc., and what mechanisms they should put into play. You'll have the introduction of the Fair Work Agency, which, if it is what is promised, will be a sea change for the recruitment industry. And I don't think people are prepared for that to happen just yet. In the 18 or so years that I've been in the industry, I think I've had an easy check once, and easy is Employment Agency's Standards Inspectorate, which is, in my opinion, ridiculous. It should be, by every 2 years, maybe 3 years, or do what the Germans do in that sense and really start thinking about, okay, well, you're in it for the first year. Let's make sure you're doing it right. Second year, we'll come back. Third year, we'll come back. And then fifth year and then 10th year. And I think that that's one model that potentially the Fair Work Agency should look at. The Fair Work Agency is 3 different agencies all combining. So you have HMRC in terms of the holiday pay and national minimum wage being brought in. You have Easy, and they also have the gang masters as well, and they'll come in with a different perspective because they're coming from a very regulated, licensed environment. Easy's not. Easy's only regulated, and obviously HMRC have teeth. So if you combine all 3, you're going to end up with a regulator who will have teeth. And the word that I'm hearing from the back corridors of the Palace of Westminster is that it's going to need to be self-funding as well. So that means how it's going to be self-funding. They're going to start putting in fines in place and penalties. So they will be quite, if they can get the manpower, then they will be quite, I won't say vociferous, but certainly they will go after people where needed. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out.
Yeah, I think that self-funding point is potentially the game changer, isn't it? And I think it's similar with the way that the government are positioning activities with HMRC now, which is they're desperate for for the taxes to be increased and taken in. And so there needs to be more enforcement activity. And I know you've been a big advocate for many years of recruitment businesses operating compliantly and just addressing the processes that they need to operate in. But when you look at the basics of things like even key information documents, there's still many recruitment businesses that either don't do it or actually aren't aware that it's a thing and it's required, particularly when we see new start companies forming, where they might have been working in large organizations where a lot of this compliance and process was dealt with. Those consultants aren't necessarily aware. So I think there's still a place for education around that, but you're quite right. If the enforcement activity follows and audits do take place regularly, it'll make people take it seriously. And I think that's to the benefit of everyone, most importantly the workers, but also the reputation of the recruitment market as well, to make sure that those processes are followed and delivering the benefits that we're seeing, and creating a level playing field for those that do pay attention and sometimes wonder why should we if we never get reviewed as such. So yeah, be interesting to see.
And the
But
government also, sorry,
Go on,
just
sorry,
one
Sean,
quick
go
thing.
on.
The government
Yeah,
already has a model that works.
yeah,
Okay, and it's the Information Commissioner's Office. And what they do is really, and for people that work in that world, hopefully will attest to this, they're very much carrot and stick. They will say, come to us if you're not sure, come to us if you have a problem. If you think you've got an issue, come to us and tell us. And then they will spend time to get it corrected, because that's the last thing they want, is to go out and fine and actually be the enforcement body. But when they do fine, normally it's where a business has tried to hide malpractice. It's normally where their rigor is lacking. There's no compliance. There's nothing along those lines. And that's where it's like, well, guys, you could have come and spoke to us. You chose not to. We're going to throw the book at you. Yeah. If you look at the way that they propel themselves and advertise their services, they are very pro. Come and talk to us. We're happy to help, because it means they can get inside your business, have a look around, make sure you're compliant, and then walk away. It's one less business to check. So you start thinking like that's nudge theory at its finest.
Yeah. And I'm doing a session next week, a webinar on mergers and acquisitions. And of course, when people are looking at selling the businesses, it tends to be gaps in compliance that drive the value of the business down. So actually getting an audit and a tick in the box to say you've got a good health check there is actually good value for the business as well, if you're at that stage.
And we'll see over the next few years where IR35 liabilities will start to kick in, where HMRC will start hitting the private sector, because it's coming up to that point in time where it's made it round to their desks, where they start going in and doing these audits. That will drive the value of businesses down where they haven't been compliant with IR35 legislation. And that will be a great thing to point to over the next sort of 6 months to a year.
Yeah, the top two generally are getting misclassification wrong, whether it's IR35 or internationally, or using non-compliant umbrella businesses. So exactly. you can see the themes there. We've obviously talked a little bit there about the changes that are occurring here with the Employment Rights Bill coming through. Do you see any opportunity though here for recruitment businesses to gain from the fact that there's now these additional costs coming through for hirers to carry workers? Do you think there's an opportunity there for recruitment businesses to tap into?
Yeah, it's you're starting to demonstrate how compliant you are. You're starting to, if you think about the Employment Rights Act as it will be, there's a lot of things there that you can create a really good community of workers for you, and you keep them all connected to you. So you reference this person before they start. You're making sure that they're a happy worker. They've got all the right regulations that sit behind them, protect them, give them the opportunities to take paid, paternity leave, etc., and things, their day one worker rights. If you start saying, look, I've got a community, I look after my workers, you put yourself up higher than most people, because they see it's really transactional. And then you get loyalty from your workers. Then you start saying, well, your workers are going into multiple agency usage clients, and workers talk to each other, and they'll start saying, what do you want? How are you being looked after? Oh, my agency's brilliant. They've done X, Y, and Z. That's an internal referral that you're going to, you can't buy that kind of marketing.
Yeah.
So there's a really good play here for, making sure that, you're putting your agency front and center of being, compliant with the ERA, but equally just being a bloody good employer. And I think that's the crux of what the ERA is. More than anything else, it's just to demonstrate that, hey, look, we've got a really good, happy workforce that will work best for my clients.
Yeah.
And then you start thinking about, okay, well, if I understand the ERA, how can I work with my clients? What are the things that they may or may not be aware of now? So right now, it's a really great footing for you to springboard into your clients, to speak to those hiring managers. Hey, what's the ERA going to do to you? Well, what is the ERA? Well, then, hey, let me tell you about this, and then you can run it through. So again, you get buy-in from your potential clients because they start to understand that you know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
So
and that was the point. I think that's a good point, and I've made it before, which is, yeah, there are some risks around this, but if we all agree that part of the role that we deliver when we're managing contractor workers on behalf of end hirers is to take that risk on, then if they're seeing increased risk, then there's potential to pick up some of those workers. We've seen a couple of clients come to us where they, as a reaction to IR35, took temporary workers on fixed term contracts directly, and now they're understanding what the liabilities could be down the pipe with the ERA. They're like, okay, we might, notwithstanding the umbrella reforms, keen to outsource these and shift them to a business like Giant. So, by extension, that can also be a conversation that a recruitment agency is involved with as well. So get your house in order, be the good employer that you said, and be a good place where businesses can outsource that risk. That's ultimately what we're doing here, as well as the search and selection piece.
And equally, you start thinking about how can I utilize my umbrella PSL to make or to give me the opportunity to win bigger projects.
Yeah.
Hey, look, Mr. Client, or Mrs. Client, these are the PSL that I work with. Actually, I've got 3 of them coming to the meeting to the pitch, and they can
Yeah.
tell you exactly how they do things. So it gives you the reassurance that you're actually going to be complying with the new umbrella regulations, but equally complying with the ERA.
Yeah. We've mentioned, obviously we've mentioned the ERA, you've mentioned IR35 as well. One of the, I hesitate to say solutions, but one of the ways that businesses can construct how they engage contractors is by using statement of work arrangements,
Mm-hmm.
paying people on milestones and deliverables rather than simple hourly and day rate and time and materials. It's long been said in the market that, if businesses were to revert to a statement of work approach, it would allow them to access contingent talent much better, much more widely, given, the ERB consequences here as well. Do you think we might see companies really get stuck into that? I've never really seen it take off hugely from a recruitment market sector, but there's more and more pain here pointing to, if you can move people to SOW, that's a good way forward. What's your thoughts, Sean?
I think that the end user clients missed a massive trick at the implementation of the private sector IR35 arrangements. I think that they didn't move quick enough and haven't moved quick enough, I should say, in actually appreciating why do I need this task to be done? And you got to break it down. If you're an end user client, you got to break down what is it I need. If I've got Jill going on maternity leave, and I need someone just to take over for 6, 12, 18 months, however long that she chooses to take off on leave, then yes, I should get an agency PAYE worker that's inside of scope because I'm replacing like for like. Would you, in the same scenario, go for an outside of scope IR35? No, not at all, because they'll be under direct supervision and control. There's mutuality of obligation, etc., etc. Right? So we know that that model wouldn't work. However, have I got a project where I'm building a new data center, or have I got a project where we're going to do a complete business transformation that has got a set parameter, a set period of timelines that I can actually parcel up into a correct project, like you said, which has deliverables and milestones. And that's the point that I pay on. And yes, put penalties in place for late completion, put rewards or bonuses in place for early completion, and have a signed off structure. So the benefits of going down that model is that you start thinking, well, okay, well, I don't have the liability that sits up with the ERA. Somebody will in the chain, but it won't be the end user because they've got a parceled up outsourced piece of work. And then you start thinking, well, that means I don't have to pay ER nicks as well. And then it
Yeah.
changes the complete narrative. And then the worker won't have to be asking for such a higher rate because they will only have to pay corporation tax, etc., based on that they're going to be running through their PSC.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you structure it correctly and actually use contractors for a distinct purpose, there's no problem going down an agency PAYE inside a scope route. That is absolutely fine, and that should be a must. But you can work with outside of scope of IR35 if it is done correctly and your business understands the relationship, because that's the key bit. You don't have somebody joining your Christmas lunch, for argument's sake. It's coming up to that time of year. They can go, but they'll have to pay their own way. Now, that's fine. But if you pay for them, then is that a benefit in kind? Is that something that an employee would receive? Yes. So it's, you've got to start reimagining why I want this task to be completed and what is the purpose of that task. And that's the thing you've got to ask.
Yeah, it's a lot of talk out there now in the market. It's about getting the work done, not necessarily how the work's done. It can be FTC, it can be workers on agency PAYE, it can be statement of work, but at the end user level, they're becoming more and more focused on how do we get this work, done, getting it rather than, how we're going to engage contractors around it. So if you can have multiple different ways as a recruitment business that you can offer that, then I think you're likely to win. Let's move on to our final topic, conscious of time. Just again, guys, if you can submit any questions that you've got for Sean into the Q&A on any of these topics, then we'll pick them up shortly. But let's move on to our final topic around global expansion. So certainly been a very, very overt trend over the last 12, 18 months with the way that the UK market has been, that many UK recruiters have taken the steps to explore international markets for the first time, hoping that the grass may be greener, but at least trying to diversify a little bit, whether it's by sector or obviously by country. So I know it's interesting speaking to you on this topic, Sean, given that you've got a load of knowledge there and, to facilitate companies to do that global expansion, but you're a big advocate of challenging the thinking there in the first instance to ensure that businesses are really, really clear on the why they're making that move. Because obviously global expansion is a big step. It brings a lot more complexity into the business. So really fascinated to hear what are the sort of key questions that you should think a recruitment business should be asking themselves before they make this move to go international.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the big thing is the why. What is the purpose for doing this? Is it a vanity project? If it's a vanity project, I would say stop, rethink, and actually come back to this is a business case decision. So really dig deep into the why. You may have a fantastic biller inside of the business or a member of the leadership team that has come from another country and they're thinking about relocating back. Now that's a really good positive decision there, because they already know what the company culture is like. They already know what the company risk appetite's like. And then you can actually task them to go out and start sourcing. Okay, why should we go to this city? What is the benefit to our business? Is it a hotspot for the sectors that we operate in? Or is it a country where there's a distinct tax advantage by going and working out there? I've got a client of mine that has just asked me to help them with 14 different potential expansion projects. Now, you think, wow, that's a lot of work. And yes, it is a lot of work. But what they're doing first is they're saying, okay, how do we compliantly operate outside of that country, as in remotely, and we service that country from a distance? What kind of legislative requirements do we have, what licenses, etc., that we need to obtain? So that's one way of doing it. It's almost like a try before you buy. What are the risks? And actually they're asking me to go, okay, well, this is our top 5. We really do want to go in there. We're going to operate remotely to start off to see what the marketplace is like. If we do go, what is the cost to set up? So there's something that's going to come down and affect everybody that's operating remotely in the Netherlands. There is going to be a registration requirement there. And part of that registration requirement is going to be a forfeiture. And that forfeiture could be somewhere between 50 to 150,000 euros. They really haven't got the nail on the head yet, but that will be deposited into the Dutch government bank account. If you get any penalties, they'll be levied against that forfeiture, and then you'll have to top that back up. And equally, the Dutch government is going to your end clients that are in the Netherlands and saying, if you use somebody that's not registered, we're going to fine you too. So they've really taken up a double-edged approach to this. Now, these are the kind of questions that most people won't ask, and they may go into a jurisdiction, they may rely on somebody else to support them, which is great, but really dig into it to actually understand the why we're doing this. Is it because we've got somebody in our management team? Is it because our clients are asking for it? When I joined my last company, they had a great relationship with one of the biggest MSP providers in the world at that point. And they asked the question, hey, where are you expanding to next? Oh, we're picking up a new client in Germany. Oh, great. Okay, well, tell us about them. Yes, they're in life sciences. Yes, this is. Okay, well, what do we need to do to help service you in Germany? You need to get this, this, and this. So you can piggyback off the back of an existing relationship, whether it be by client or MSP provider.
Yeah, I think that's a good point actually. It makes that a little bit more of a softer landing, doesn't it? At least if you're already plumbed in via an MSP program and you're talking to them and they're expanding into different sectors, that means that you can get a bit more assurance on the level of business as opposed to just having to go sort of direct and expand and build up your own market knowledge, which can take time. So I think that's a good takeaway. And yeah, it's interesting you're talking about the Netherlands. We had a webinar on that yesterday. And the guys, the lawyers were pointing out that in a couple of years' time, there's going to be these licensing requirements. So there's risk around it, and you can see the direction travel in many countries. Which we've talked about what's happening in the UK on employment rights bill and FWA, etc. But all this should be adding value to great delivery from a good quality recruitment business that's got these boxes ticked, that understands the compliance, that has the right processes. It's differentiation in a market that is getting more and more complex, and the legislation is coming through thick and fast all over the world. So I think if recruiters embrace that, then there's certainly opportunity there. I think the other thing I wanted to pick your brains on here as well, Sean, is that we've seen an increased mobility of talent around the world. Certainly our global screening business is regularly seeing workers now that are almost nomadic, going from country to country, operating and delivering in certain verticals. So how should recruiters approach this situation where people are moving around a lot more into different territories, where they're looking at speaking to candidates who are either wanting to move into other countries or work remotely? Or what are the key risks and opportunities you think that presents?
Well, if you look at what happened over the weekend, or maybe just prior to the end of last week, with Trump deciding to put $100,000 bounty on HNB, I think it was H-1B visas in the US, that had most of the tech sector panicking, calling people back who are outside the country or about to go outside of the country, saying don't leave. Because again, he was saying one thing, the State Department was not State Department, the Internal Department was saying another thing, and there was confusion there. So you've got to really to understand what's happening with your workforce that you may be bringing across. What are the visa restrictions for that country that you may be operating in? Really dig and understand those. If you don't have a great immigration lawyer partner, I would highly recommend you getting involved with one of those, and that will be an in-country partner as well, because you want to make sure that you're up to date with what's going on, how that can operate. You've got to be a partner with your client. If the labor requirement is outside of the country and there's no other better way of doing it, then you can start saying, well, these are the costs that will sit and be attributed to that engagement. Always, in my opinion, should always try local first if you can. And then that builds up your marketplace and your presence in the marketplace. From a compliance point of view, it just adds a layer of complexity, which is fine if you've got the capability and the competence to deal with that. If you don't, look for a partner that could potentially support you in that. Also,
Yeah.
also look for a provider who's in a position to pay. Because if you say that, okay, we've got a vacancy that's in Iceland, for argument's sake, and we've got a contractor that could do the job remotely based in India, you're going to start walking yourself into a potential pitfall here, because you may end up permanently establishing yourself in India. Now, India tax, from off the top of my head, their corporate tax is your global revenue if you're established in, have this pseudo permanent establishment in India of 40% of your global revenue because you've got a worker that's working for you for a client in Iceland. So
Yeah, you don't want to get that wrong.
no. So there's different ways. So speak with a payrolling partner or an EOR provider or someone like yourself and really interrogate, okay, what are the best ways that we can do this? So you break that chain of permanent establishment, and
Yeah.
that minimizes the risk of, a financial risk to you now, but equally, the reputational risk could be huge because all you're going to do is annoy your client and annoy the worker.
Yeah. So I understood, and I think if you're doing spot business and it's ones and twos, then certainly you want to avoid that establishment risk point. But I'm going to ask you the reverse question, though. In your opinion, when does it make sense for a recruitment business to start looking at putting people on the ground locally and building up their own presence there, as opposed to leaning into an employer of record like Giant Global?
Yeah, again, that's down to the appetite of the management because for me, I would always recommend set up a working remote business that you prove the concept because you may have investors as well. So you're going to have to potentially, you know, pander to them a little bit to say, look, yeah, this is definitely what we're going to do. This is our expansion plan. This is the structure that we're going to take. We're going to do it remotely, see how we land, what the marketplace is like, or we've got a business that we can piggyback off. Once we hit a certain threshold in terms of it could be self-sufficient, if we had a headcount of 5 in an office, we know the offices roughly will cost X. We know that this is going to cost Y. We know our tax obligations are going to be this, et cetera, et cetera. And it's at that point you start saying, right, well, we're getting close to this point of we can actually start setting up. Don't wait until you cross that point. Start looking, okay, well, this is where we're going to, and you start digging into the detail a little bit more significantly. And what do we need to do? It could take 6 months to set up an entity out there, wherever that
Yeah.
happens to be. You could end up hitting a wall of bureaucracy that you weren't anticipating. And even the best lawyers, when they're setting up a company in some countries, sometimes they may not work as ethically as others.
Yeah.
So you've got to preempt what it's going to be. So my advice is set yourself a clear indicator. This is the point where we're going to consider setting up on the ground. We start understanding what the full structure of that is going to take. We're going to give ourselves a time period. Because you're going to have to hire in that period as well to open up the ground. So this is the other things you've got to really start contemplating.
Yeah, it's almost planning when do we get to the point of no return, almost where it just becomes the natural progression that we set up locally and we invest in that, etc., etc. But you're quite right; these things take time to bed in, so it's not a turn this around in a few weeks. You're going to be talking a good number of months to plan for that properly. Just
Yeah.
final question on that before we go to the audience's questions, and please do send those through if you've got any off the back of this topic. When recruiters are thinking about setting up, locally, what's your views on whether or not they build their own, in-house systems and infrastructure versus looking at outsourcing parts of that to an organization? Because there's always this opportunity to sort of buy or build versus, borrow or outsource. Have you got any particular thoughts on that?
Again, it's the sophistication of the business in question. They may have a setup. They may be able to do that off the bat because they've done it before. They may have their own proprietary, IT system that they can run, and they can deal with that. Others, where cost constraints, etc., may be a big consideration, then yeah, absolutely outsource it. But make sure you've got it with a trusted partner that you vet, that you audit, that you ask the right questions of, do your D&D on them, to make sure that, yeah, I'm putting my baby in your hands. I wouldn't just give it to a stranger on the street.
Yeah.
This is aimed more at founders and owners of businesses. But, really do your due diligence. Yes, it's going to take time. I totally get it. And time is one thing that it's a recruiter's worst enemy. But ultimately, you've really got to do that due diligence. This is a huge step for your organization. This is going to transform you from being, something that is relatively small but self-sufficient to being something that is quite substantial. Having multiple jurisdictional offices is nothing to be sniffed at. And that will increase your potential sale value if you look elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can demonstrate that you can tap into different markets with your model and scale that, then that's absolutely important for valuation. It's interesting. I was talking to a recruitment business yesterday who'd been through this process in setting up in Germany, I think it was, and they would certainly recognise some of those pain points that you've highlighted. But also, it was the actual closing down of the business and exiting the country, which was also really time consuming. So one thing I would say is that often, you can be dealing with initially an employer of record type business to manage some of this. The better ones, and Giant certainly I would put in that camp, obviously, can then pivot to move to a managed payroll solution. So you can still retain that partner, but you can become the employer of record locally. And there's consultants like yourself that can help with the setup and the licensing and the considerations. Or before you get to the full ends of the spectrum where you're acquiring a company or you're building your own solution. So you can take this in baby steps throughout. It doesn't have to, and it doesn't have to be a situation that you can't reverse either.
And that's one thing that you just mentioned, that international expansion isn't potentially you going and setting up a business. It could be, and it could mean that you go and acquire a business.
Yeah.
And then it's a completely different scenario. How do we integrate that business into ours? How do we bring our culture that we want to have into that business? Do you start looking at that business and go, hey, you guys are doing some great things that we've never thought about, then bringing their culture into your business? So there's lots of different ways you can go, expand internationally. It's not just, you putting bums on seats.
Yeah, for sure. Super conscious of time because we're coming up to time. That was fascinating, Sean, to go through those topics. Thanks for sharing your insight. As we did say, we'd pick out a couple of questions that have come through from the audience at the end here. So let's just have a look through. We've got a question here from Gordon. Bear with me a second because it's a long one. So what's your view on, so I think we're talking about umbrella reforms here. What's your view on where liability would lie in a situation where a gig worker was provided through a software platform that does some work and uses an umbrella company for payment? Rare, I know. Well, I'd actually say that's not necessarily that rare because a lot of the platforms actually lean into umbrella companies underneath the bonnet to deliver the payroll. So just to recap, what's your view of where liability would lie in a situation where a gig worker provided through a software platform does some work and uses an umbrella company for payment?
So the short answer is that there's no recruitment organization involved in any of this, is there? It's just purely umbrella.
I think that's the challenge there is actually this software platform. You're probably wanting to understand actually, is that delivering recruitment services or is it just simply operating as a platform? I think that's probably one of the main challenges. So would someone working through a gig platform, do you think, using an umbrella underneath, would that be caught in reforms and present joint and several liability?
It certainly could be. I think it's really nuanced because you start thinking about, okay, well, if you use a certain food delivery or a taxi company as an example here, their drivers and riders have now got employment rights.
Yeah.
So if you're using that logic, if they've got employment rights, then the reforms would apply as well. But my only concern is that it depends on where this, because this is another question as well, where the platform is domiciled. Because if the platform's not domiciled in the UK and there's no UK-based presence, that would then create another issue.
Yeah.
So it's a really, really nuanced thing that you've got to have, you'd have to interrogate a little bit more. But if we took it that it was a domiciled platform in the UK, it was a delivery rider or a gig worker who's domiciled in the UK, and it was working through a domiciled UK umbrella company, then my default answer is yes, it would be caught.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Best practice would be that you should do that and demonstrate that you're complying with that, because the key pin here is that the gig workers under UK law have employment rights, or it's been proven that they have employment rights.
Yeah, I agree with that assertion generally. And you're right to point out there'll be loads of different factors in that scenario. But if you go with the one that you put forward,
it's a bloody good question, though.
It is a good question. It gets to the core. It gets to the core of whether these recruitment platforms are accessing workers or actually employment businesses. And I know if you speak to some of the lawyers, and you've got things like the EU platform directive
I was about to
floating
mention
around,
that.
that's defaulting to say anyone working through a platform in the EU is going to be automatically assumed to be an employee,
Yep.
and then you've got to work backwards from that point. So I think fundamentally, the industry and the authorities are looking more at the platforms as recruiters. It doesn't matter if it's not a person at the end of the phone doing the basics. Even if the technology is delivering a recruitment service, then there's an argument that these rules that we've been through today do apply. So I think in that scenario, you should operate as though they do apply, and that's the safest bet. There was one last question because we're at time. It was again about umbrella reform. Someone was asking if you have any views on insurance and whether or not that can play a part in reducing risk for agencies, because there's been a lot of talk about insurance solutions around this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and untested ground at the moment, because you're touching on the potential for it to be an MSC, and that's a whole different headache that sits in IPTI. Section 7, I think, of IPTI. It sits under. And you've got to be really careful with that. So I think try and interrogate, okay, well, what insurance is this going to provide? Who's going to take up the insurance? There's some great insurers out there who offer tested products. I'll mention two. Kudos is one, Kingsbridge is another. They're specifically around IR35 insurances. So what they do, though, is they will help your end client make the SDS. So they have a level of control of actually going, well, you've fit this parameter, you've answered these questions in this way. That then sets up the risk appetite for them to understand. They are happy to ensure that if you are caught found to be operating inside of scope where you're actually, operating outside of scope where you should be operating inside of scope. So they can control that. Just a flippant, okay, well, yeah, I'll cover the insurance on that umbrella company potentially defaulting. I would sort of question, how are you measuring the risk here? What are you understanding to be the true liability? You haven't asked me for my headcount portfolio. You haven't asked me for what kind of roles they're in. You haven't asked me for the pay rates, et cetera, et cetera. So where Kingsbridge and Kudos change is they are really deep in the detail and they know what they're getting themselves open to.
Yeah, well, I know that Kudos are looking at this. In fact, I'm talking on a panel on that later on next month, so that'll be interesting. None of the insurances have been seen yet because everyone's waiting for the final legislation. So there's a lot more water to run under that bridge, but we'll have to stop there. We're out of time. Sean, fantastic. Thank you very much for joining me today. I think that was really super useful. Thank you for your insight. We'll obviously follow up with a recording in the normal way, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.